My name is Jennifer Walshe. I'm a composer and a performer, and I wrote the music for Mars. I was always interested in space. When I was a kid, my father had the book Cosmos, which was the book of the Carl Sagan television series, and I would look at that. And when I was a kid, my dad was certainly, whenever there was, an eclipse or a certain astronomical event, he was always really excited for us to look at it. The soundtrack of Cosmos has an awful lot of synth music in it. It has a lot of Vangelis in there. And there's also, music by Bach, music that it certainly in the West would be coded as, representative of human genius or the best of human pure emotional art music. So I knew I had to have some synthesizers in the piece because that made sense to me. Because what I also found was that when I looked at playlists that astronauts had uploaded to the International Space Station, they had uploaded synth albums. They'd uploaded music that came from the Cosmos soundtrack. And I think a huge amount of how we think about space is formed by our interactions with documentaries or science fiction films when we're kids. And then we try to sort of make those dreams become a reality. So a lot of astronauts, the way they think about space was informed by watching Cosmos as a kid. And so synth music is part of that dream. It's part of the space imaginary. I think I was more interested in the real sounds of what it sounded like on the International Space Station. The space exploration stack exchange community were really wonderful because I really tried to take a hard sci-fi approach and think about what are precisely the sounds you would hear if you were inside an extravehicular activity spacesuit. When we talk about spacesuits, the type of spacesuits we're talking about, these sort of life support systems, sort of the different fans and ventilation systems that you would hear, the radio sounds you would hear in there, and sort of also the actual sounds you would hear on the ISS and in a spaceship. So I was asking people, experts in that community online, and getting lots of answers and interesting information. When you're in a spaceship hurtling up into space, from what I've been told and heard and watched, it's an incredibly loud experience, not something that's soundtracked perfectly by Hollywood strings. Mark and I had been thinking about Mars for years. So before a word of the libretto had even been written, we were already sort of storing references or sort of touching against themes that we felt were relevant to the subject matter of the libretto. So we were discussing things like transhumanism, life extension, AI, Silicon Valley, the obsession with tech billionaires with space.
I'm Mark O'Connell. I'm the writer of the libretto for Mars. So I came at it through politics, really. For me, Mars was this really interesting way of thinking about this kind of moment of sort of political impasse that we're at right now. And Elon Musk, for me, was always a really intriguing kind of figure because he seems to, in one way, he's quite like, certainly when I started writing about him, he was quite a hopeful figure, and he was offering this version of the future that wasn't coming from anyone on the left. It wasn't coming from sort of mainstream culture, this idea of a kind of futuristic vision. Because I was quite interested in how the idea of the future had died on the vine, really. Like, we don't talk about the future in anything like the same way that we did in the kind of mid to late 20th century. When I was a kid, the future was still sort of a going concern, and that stopped at a certain point. And I was kind of interested in how Elon Musk, in his way, was reigniting this idea of the future through the idea of Mars colonization, but also in a very troubling way, because we're at a point with climate catastrophe where, we really need to start thinking about ways in which we can make this planet livable in the future. And the idea of kind of starting a human civilization from scratch on this completely inhospitable kind of world is very troubling and speaks to a lot of issues around capitalism and where we're at with the culture and so on. So yeah, I came at it through that kind of political route.
I was developing material as Mark was writing scenes from the libretto, but the whole thing sort of came together collaboratively, also with a lot of input from Tom Creed when we started shaping the dramaturgy and the arc. And what we were sort of shocked by was that our dystopian extrapolations of where we felt the world was going that we sort of were locking down in terms of our themes last year, well before the US election, sort of turned into reality. And we went from, we went to sort of almost writing a social realist opera in one way, even though it's a sci-fi opera. I knew vocally, when I was approaching writing vocally, that I wanted to use a very wide palette of sound. I didn't want to just use bel canto singing. I also wanted to be able to use the operatic voice with no vibrato, which sometimes can be tricky. I wanted to have them doing things that are not standard, like very, very long glissandi, or doing acoustical beating, which happens when you have like two people singing and one of them goes very slightly flat or very slightly sharp, and you get these acoustical effects, which are real acoustical effects that are happening in the room. We're taking something that's about the power of the human body, like what the singers can do with their bodies to get these sounds is phenomenal. The amount of pressure, it's not just training, it's like literally physical pressure they're imposing on their bodies to make their vocal cords vibrate in this way. And it's a huge, powerful weapon when they're singing. And there's parts where I'm saying to them, you're singing and you're at the same pitch, but you're glissandoing, and it sounds like synthesizers. It doesn't sound like human voices. I usually work with amplification, and I'm really lucky on this to have one of the most skilled sound engineers I know, Una Monaghan, working on it. And that meant that when we talked about the spec for the setup in the space, we talked about having more sub-bass speakers than you would normally have in an opera with amplification. And that means that we can give the audience this very immersive sound world. So we have a sub-bass speaker under the audience. And so it means I can play things like a recording of the Ingenuity helicopter, its first flight on Mars. And it has this three-dimensional aspect because of the way that the PA has been designed. So we're able to take these recordings, which are some of the recordings I have the most respect for, in the history of human recording, and put them into this massive sound system and make it this immersive world that the audience can sit at the center of. So I'm really delighted because that is an important part of it. I hope they'll laugh, I hope they'll cry, and I hope they'll think about the world that we live in. I hope that people at this feel a sense of kinship and commonality, and that we're all in this together.
I hope they just come away with it with a sense that they've seen something that they didn't expect, that was funny and beautiful and strange and a little unsettling, and kind of just makes them think about the idea of the future and what it means and what it could mean.